Picture the Cathedral at Canterbury. It's the summer of the year 1017. The sun is streaming through these tall, narrow windows, and it's landing on stone that's still cool from the night. The air smells of incense, right? But also of unwashed men, leather, iron. The walls of this city are still standing, which, frankly, is a miracle. Canute, the Danish prince who only months ago literally drowned England in blood, has decided not to burn this place to the ash it probably should be. Not today. Because today, standing in the filtered light of this cathedral, Canute is getting married.
And let's look closely at the bride waiting at the altar. You can almost feel the tension radiating from the English nobles who are, they're forced to attend this thing. She is older than the groom. She's in her early 30s, and he is barely 22. She is poised. She is striking. That physical presence is well attested across multiple chronicles, actually. But more importantly, look at her political weed. She is the widow of the king Canute just defeated.
Right.
She is the mother of 2 living princes who have a far, far better biological claim to the English throne than Canute ever will.
The atmosphere in that room must have been just suffocating. You have a conquering army on one side of the aisle and a deeply traumatized, totally conquered nobility on the other. And standing in the middle is a woman who has somehow orchestrated this exact moment.
Exactly. She is the daughter of the Duke of Normandy. She is the granddaughter of Vikings herself. She speaks Latin, Old English, Norman, French, and almost certainly Old Norse. When we look at her life leading up to this moment in 1017, we are looking at a woman who has already survived 3 invasions, 1 horrific coordinated massacre, 2 exiles, and, 1 profoundly terrible husband. Her name is Emma of Normandy.
And this marriage at Canterbury, it is absolutely not a romance.
Oh, no.
It is a razor-sharp negotiation between 2 of the most calculating minds of the 11th century. And the woman holding the better hand of cards, standing there quietly behind her veil, might just be Emma.
I'd argue it definitely is Emma.
Welcome back to the deep dive. The truth is, I really thought this journey was over. You've been with us for 29 previous deep dives into the source material. We've walked together through the mythology, the kings, the battles, the slow fading of the Viking world into the medieval one. You know all about Sweyn Forkbeard. You already know Cnut. You know the bloody road that ended at Stamford Bridge in Hastings in 1066. We really thought we were completely done.
We did. We really did. But as we were reviewing the final stack of sources, there was just this one figure we simply could not leave on the cutting room floor. A woman who married 2 kings of England. A woman who mothered 2 more. A woman who, by 1042, was likely the only person alive who could personally remember every single twist of the Anglo-Danish Norman story across, half a century.
And a woman whose bloodline, through her grandnephew William, would eventually conquer the country she had already ruled twice over. Without Emma of Normandy, there is no Norman conquest. There is no England as we currently understand it. So consider this the bonus. This is the 30th and true final deep dive into the source material, dedicated entirely to Emma, the queen who outlived her enemies, outplayed her husbands, and, as we will see, literally wrote her own legend.
Yes. To understand Emma, we have to start with where she comes from. We really have to understand the specific environment of Normandy at the end of the 10th century. As we covered back in Season 2, Normandy translates to Land of the Northmen. Her great-great-grandfather Rollo made that famous deal in 911 to settle the coast. But what does that mean for Emma, practically speaking, when she's born around the year 985?
I would imagine it means she's caught between worlds, right?
Yeah.
Like she's living in a French territory, but her family tree is just covered in Viking frost.
It's an incredibly potent dual identity. Her father is Richard I, Duke of Normandy. Her mother is Gunnar, who comes from a Danish family that had settled in the duchy. So, the Norman aristocracy raising Emma, they are speaking a Romance language, Norman French. They are worshiping Christ in stone churches. But their grandfathers spoke Norse and swore by Odin and Thor.
Yeah, that heritage doesn't just wash away in a generation or 2.
Exactly. The contemporary chronicles call them civilized, but the iron of the Viking world is still very much in their blood. They are essentially Vikings who have learned how to play the European feudal game.
And play it better than anyone else, frankly. So Emma grows up in this massive, ambitious family. By the late 990s, when Emma is just coming of age, England is in absolute crisis. The Vikings are back. And as you know from our earlier deep dives, they aren't just raiding for pocket silver anymore, right? They are raiding for kingdoms. Sweyn Forkbeard is probing the English coast. And the geopolitical nightmare for the English king, Ethelred II, is that these Viking fleets are using Norman ports to refit their ships.
Right. And we need to look at the mechanics of that because it's crucial to why Emma is sent to England in the first place. How does a Viking fleet actually sustain a multi-year campaign? They can't just stay on their ships indefinitely.
Right, you need infrastructure.
You do. They need safe harbors to repair hulls, to restock provisions, and most importantly, they need a black market to fence the massive amounts of loot they are pulling out of English monasteries. Normandy was functioning as a forward operating base and a clearinghouse for stolen English wealth.
So if you are King Ethelred, you have to close that back door. You have to. And in the Middle Ages, you don't close the back door to the trade embargo. You close it with a marriage bed. You tie the Norman ducal family to the English crown so they stop harboring your enemies.
Oh.
So Emma, who is roughly 17 years old, is chosen for this mission. She's sent across the channel to marry a man nearly twice her age who already has a clutch of kids from his first wife. And before we get into her arrival, we need to clear something up about Ethelred's nickname, the Unready.
Oh, please. It is perhaps the most misunderstood nickname in medieval history.
Because to a modern ear, Unready sounds like a guy who just couldn't get his boots on in time for the battle. Like he was constantly oversleeping while the Vikings burned his coastline. I see that misinterpretation everywhere.
It completely misses the joke, which is actually a devastating piece of contemporary political satire. In Old English, the word read means counsel or advice. Unread means ill-counseled, or even more cuttingly, no counsel. Now consider his actual name, Ethelred, which translates to noble counsel.
Oh, that is brutal.
It is so brutal. His contemporaries were literally calling him the king of noble counsel who has no counsel. It's an intellectual pun. It tells you exactly how little respect he commanded among the English chroniclers and the nobility. He was viewed as a man who listened to the wrong people, made paranoid decisions, and just consistently failed to protect his realm.
Wow. So Emma, at 17, sails for England in the spring of 1002 to marry the king of no counsel. I want to stop and examine a narrative here, actually. We often view these young medieval brides as passive pawns, just being shuffled around a chessboard by older men in power. But looking at her Norman and Viking heritage and the specific mandate she was given to secure this alliance, is it accurate to view Emma as a helpless teenager?
The evidence points entirely away from the helpless pawn narrative, truly. Medieval royal marriages were brutal, high-stakes diplomacy. Emma wasn't sent to England to find love or to sit quietly in a solar with her embroidery. She was deployed as a human shield, a diplomatic instrument designed to block the Danish fleets.
Right.
To survive in that role, especially arriving in a foreign court that was already defined by paranoia and factionalism, it required immense political acumen. She had to evaluate factions, identify threats, and secure her own position from the very moment she stepped off the boat.
If you watch the Netflix series Vikings, Valhalla, they actually capture this dynamic perfectly. They portray Emma as this sharp, cool-headed political operator right from the jump. She's a woman of Norman blood navigating a very dangerous Viking and Anglo-Saxon world. If you watch her early scenes in the show, she is constantly reading the room before she speaks. She watches how the men posture. She identifies the weak links. It's a very, very deliberate performance.
The historical record absolutely supports that depiction of her character. She had to be that way because the English court was inherently hostile to outsiders. To mark her acceptance into England, to forcibly assimilate her, upon her arrival, she is given a new English name, Elfgifu.
I'm so glad we don't have to use that name for the rest of this discussion because Elfgifu is an absolute nightmare for historians.
It truly is a headache. It was an incredibly common noble name. In fact, Canut's future first wife was also named Elfgifu of Northampton. When you read the medieval chronicles, the monks are constantly confusing the two women, or they just vaguely refer to the queen, leaving us to decipher which Elfgifu they mean from the context. So for the sake of clarity, our sources and modern historians generally stick to calling her Emma.
Let's definitely stick with Emma. So she arrives, she gets a new name, but she doesn't just quietly fold into English life, right? She brings what is effectively an island of Normandy with her own household, her own Norman priests, her own confessor.
Yeah, this was a standard but highly visible display of power. She wasn't just assimilating, she was maintaining her Norman roots and her independent power base within the English court. She had her own lands, granted as part of her dower, which meant she had her own independent income. And despite the deeply unhappy nature of the marriage, because Ethelred was older, set in his ways, and deeply distrustful of her Norman entourage, she did her duty. She bore him 3 children. Edward, who listeners will know as Edward the Confessor, Alfred, and a daughter named Godgifu.
And while she's raising these kids, she is getting a master class in how power actually works in England. Because the English system wasn't an absolute monarchy. The king's word wasn't law just because he said it was. True power required the backing of the Witan, the council of nobles and senior clergy.
We should break down the mechanism of the Witan, actually, because it's critical to Emma's later survival. The Witan wasn't a modern parliament, it was an advisory council, but their leverage was immense. They controlled the regional armies, the fyrds, they controlled the local tax collection. If the king wanted to raise an army to fight the Vikings, or raise silver to pay them off, he had to have the consensus of the Witan.
Right.
Emma learned very quickly that to have power, you had to cultivate the men in that room. She built relationships with bishops, made strategic donations to monasteries to win ecclesiastical support. She was laying groundwork.
And she needed that groundwork desperately because she had been Queen of England for only a few months when her husband made a decision that would ultimately destroy his dynasty. This brings us to the disaster. November 13th, 1002, St. Brice's Day.
Ethelred orders the St. Brice's Day massacre. He issues a royal decree to kill all the Danes living in England.
It is a horrifying, sweeping order for ethnic cleansing. But I'm trying to wrap my head around the logistics of this. How do you even coordinate a massacre across an entire country in the year 1002? I mean, there's no mass communication, there's no standing police force. How did this actually play out on the ground?
It was likely disseminated through sealed letters sent to the ealdormen, the regional lords, and the town reeves, with strict instructions to open them on a specific date. They used the element of total surprise. Now, he certainly didn't succeed in killing every Dane in England. As we know from our map of the era, the Danelaw in the north and east was simply too densely populated with Scandinavians for a wholesale slaughter. The locals there were the Danes.
Yeah, that would be suicide to try and attack the Danelaw like that.
Exactly. But in the south, in Ethelred's core territories, it was a brutal, coordinated pogrom against Danish communities that had been settled there for generations, or mercenaries who'd been hired by the English crown.
The physical evidence of this is chilling. I was reading about the archaeological dig in Oxford. A group of Danes, realizing what was happening, fled into the church of St. Fridswide to claim sanctuary. And the local English mob didn't just break down the doors, they literally burned the church to the ground with the people trapped inside.
And we aren't just relying on monks' chronicles for that story either. Archaeologists excavating near St. John's College in Oxford found the mass graves charred, fractured bones of men and young adults dating exactly to this period. The forensic evidence shows they were slaughtered violently and then burned. And, well, the most disturbing part is how Ethelred justified it. We have his own words in a royal charter from 1004 where he was granting lands to rebuild that very church in Oxford.
What does the charter actually say?
He writes that it was well known that he had ordered all the Danes who had sprung up in this island, sprouting like cockle amongst the wheat, to be destroyed by a most just extermination. He proudly admits that the Danes in Oxford were burned alive in the church because they were trying to escape his decree.
Sprouting like cockle amongst the wheat. It's the language of a gardener pulling weeds. It is the chilling, detached rhetoric of a deeply paranoid king trying to purge his own kingdom.
But the political fallout was catastrophic. Among those killed in the massacre was, according to very strong tradition, a woman named Gunhilde. She was a Danish noblewoman who had been taken hostage to ensure peace. More importantly, she was the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark.
I have to interject here because if Ethelred's goal was to secure his kingdom from Viking raids, this is quite literally the worst strategy imaginable. It's like discovering a grease fire in your kitchen and deciding the best way to handle it is to throw a bucket of water on it.
That is the perfect analogy.
You don't put out the fire, you instantly vaporize the water and create an explosive, unstoppable catastrophe that burns the whole house down.
Exactly. Ethelred's massacre failed to eliminate the Danes as a demographic force, but it succeeded perfectly in giving Sweyn Forkbeard a personal blood feud. It turned what had previously been highly profitable, pragmatic Viking raids into a holy war of vengeance. Sweyn wasn't coming for silver anymore, he was coming for Ethelred's head.
I can't help but wonder what Emma was thinking during all this.
Gotcha.
She's 18, maybe 19 years old. She had Viking heritage herself. Her mother was of Danish descent. She's sitting in this court watching her much older, deeply unhinged husband slaughter people who are essentially her distant kin. and she has absolutely no power to stop it.
The sources don't give us her internal monologue, unfortunately, but based on her later actions, we can deduce that she must have realized the sheer incompetence of her husband's strategy. She had a front-row seat to a king actively unraveling his own realm. The St. Brice's Day massacre ignited a decade of relentless war that pushed England to the absolute brink, bleeding the treasury dry and eventually forcing Emma into her first exile.
Let's look at the mechanics of that bleeding, because the Danegeld during this period reaches absurd levels. We hear these numbers, right? 24,000 pounds of silver, then 36,000, then 48,000 pounds of silver. But what does that actually mean? How do you even move 48,000 pounds of silver in the 11th century?
It requires a massive, agonizing state apparatus. It meant melting down church relics, stripping the gold and silver off crosses. It meant the Watan authorizing brutal taxes on every hide of land in the country. To pay 48,000 pounds of silver, you are literally draining the economic lifeblood of the agrarian economy.
Right.
You have to mint it into pennies, load it into thousands of heavy oak chests, and transport it by ox cart to the coast under heavy guard just to hand it over to men who are going to come back next year and ask for more.
It's an extortion racket on a national scale. And finally, the racket breaks the state. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard arrives with a massive fleet not to raid, but to conquer. He sweeps through the country, the English resistance collapses, and Ethelred flees to the Isle of Wight and then across the Channel.
He flees back to Normandy, to the court of Emma's brother, Duke Richard II. Emma has come full circle. She left a decade earlier as a teenage bride sent to secure a kingdom. She returns as an exiled queen with a broken husband, young children, and a deeply uncertain future.
But the whiplash of these next few years is insane. Just as Emma is settling into exile, in 1014, Sweyn Forkbeard suddenly dies. The Danish fleet immediately acclaims his teenage son, Canute, as king. But the English nobles do something fascinating. They invite Ethelred back.
But not unconditionally. This is a crucial moment in English constitutional history. The Witan sends messengers to Normandy, and they tell Ethelred they will accept him back as king, but only if he promises to rule them better than he did before. They force him to forgive past disloyalty and reform his laws.
They force a legal concession from their own king. It shows you exactly how weak Ethelred truly was and how much leverage the Witan possessed. So Ethelred returns, Canute is temporarily driven out to sea, but Canute isn't finished. He comes back in 1015 with a hardened, massive, vengeful army. The war grinds on brutally until April 1016, when Ethelred finally dies.
And the war still doesn't end. Ethelred's son from his first marriage, Edmund Ironside, takes up the crown. He fights Canute to a standstill over a brutal summer of campaigning, ending at the Battle of Asandun. They agree to split the kingdom, but then Edmund suddenly dies in November 1016.
Right, which listeners will remember from our earlier deep dives. So by December 1016, the dust finally settles. Canute, at 21 years old, is the undisputed king of England.
And this brings Canute to a massive structural problem. Yes, he is a conqueror. He has the throne by force of arms, but he is a foreigner. He does not have the institutional legitimacy, the bureaucratic machinery, or the deep consent of the English realm. You can conquer a country from horseback, but you cannot govern it from horseback. He needs to bind himself to the English state. And the most powerful, influential, wealthy, unmarried woman in Northern Europe is sitting right there in London.
Emma, the Dowager Queen. So in July 1017, they marry. Emma is roughly 32, Canute is 22. And this is the moment Emma stops being a supporting character in someone else's war and steps into the light as a master player.
What's fascinating here is the sheer audacity of her demands during the marriage negotiations. The chronicles, particularly her own later writings, tell us she didn't just passively agree to marry the man who had conquered her husband's kingdom. She negotiated hard. She demanded that any son she bore Canute would jump the line of succession, inheriting the English throne ahead of any sons Canute already had with his first consort, Elfgifru of Northampton.
I need to pause on that. She dictates succession terms to a Viking warlord who just finished slaughtering half the English nobility. I mean, that takes incredible nerve. But the cost of this deal was incredibly heavy. To remain queen, she abandons her sons from her first marriage, Edward and Alfred, who are about 13 and 10 years old. She leaves them in Normandy in exile.
She won't see them again for nearly 30 years.
I have to challenge the historical consensus here. The sources, and often modern historians, try to frame this as a calculated necessity. But was abandoning her young sons really a mark of maternal sacrifice? Are we giving her too much credit? We're looking at a woman who just married the man who killed her husband's people. Isn't it just as likely she coldly traded her children for a crown? What source actually proves she cared about their safety over her own ambition?
That is exactly the right question to ask, and it gets to the heart of how we interpret medieval women in power. We don't have a diary where she confesses her emotional state. What we have is the geopolitical reality of a dowager queen. If Emma had stayed a widow, she was a massive political liability. She would have been a target for any English faction looking to control her sons and start a rebellion against Canute. If she brought her sons to England, Canute would almost certainly have had them killed to eliminate rival claimants. That was standard operating procedure for a new dynasty.
Okay, so keeping them in Normandy kept a knife away from their throats.
Exactly. By marrying Canute, she neutralizes herself as a threat to him. She retains her vast personal wealth, her lands, and her household, and she keeps her older sons out of Canute's immediate grasp, safely under the protection of the Norman Duke. But to your point, we cannot ignore the ambition. Canute needed Emma just as much as she needed him.
Why, though? Why did Canute need her so badly that he agreed to disinherit his own older children?
Because Emma was the institutional key to England. She provided the crucial link to the old dynasty, smoothing the transition for the English nobility and the church. When the bishops looked at the throne, they didn't just see a Viking raider. They saw their anointed Queen Emma sitting beside him. Furthermore, she neutralized the threat of Normandy. If Canute didn't marry her, the Norman dukes might have used Emma's sons as a permanent pretext to launch an invasion of England to reclaim the throne. She was, essentially, 3 geopolitical alliances wrapped into one person.
It is intense, unsentimental mutual opportunism. If we go back to Vikings, Valhalla for a second, the show frames this relationship brilliantly. It doesn't present it as some sweeping, bodice-ripping romance where they instantly fall in love. It's portrayed as a slow-burning, deeply wary partnership between two people who are essentially colleagues in power. They know they need each other, they respect each other's ruthless intelligence, even if they can't fully trust each other at first.
And that rings entirely true to the historical reality. This was a statecraft partnership. And it sets the stage for what we can call Emma's golden years. From 1017 to 1035, Emma is effectively the queen of the North Sea.
She has 2 children with Canute, a son, Harthacnut, and a daughter, Gudhilda. And she is not just sitting around doing embroidery or organizing feasts. She is an active, functioning co-ruler.
The documentary evidence for her power in this period is striking. She witnesses his royal charters, meaning her seal and approval were legally required for state business. When Canute is traveling to manage his massive North Sea empire, which, as listeners will remember, eventually includes Denmark, England, and Norway, he cannot be everywhere at once. Who is running England while he is pacifying Norway? Emma. She is receiving foreign envoys, corresponding directly with the Pope, and managing the sprawling domestic administration.
There's a specific image you pulled from the sources that illustrates this perfectly. It's from the Liber Vitae of Newminster. I'd love for you to describe the exact artistic composition of that manuscript, because it really paints a picture of how Emma demanded to be seen.
It's a magnificent piece of political theology drawn in Winchester. It shows Canute and Emma standing on either side of a great cross, presenting a massive gold cross to the altar. In medieval art, scale dictates importance. Canute and Emma are drawn at exactly the same scale, which is highly significant. It implies equality. Furthermore, there are angels descending from the top of the frame. One angel is placing a crown on Canute's head, and another angel is simultaneously placing a crown on Emma's head.
That is deliberate visual propaganda. It says, she isn't just the king's wife. She is the sovereign chosen by God in her own right. It reminds me of a modern corporate structure. Canute is the charismatic founder of the company. He's constantly flying around to open new international branches, putting out fires in Denmark, acquiring subsidiaries in Norway. But Emma is the brilliant CEO back at headquarters. She's actually running the day-to-day operations, controlling the treasury, keeping the board of directors, the Witan happy, and building a massive power base in Winchester.
That's a very apt modern analogy. And quietly in the background, she is grooming her son, Harthacnut. She is raising him to believe that he, and only he, is the sole legitimate heir to this entire sprawling empire. She is courting the English nobles, distributing wealth to monasteries, laying the groundwork for his eventual succession over Canute's older sons.
But the inherent flaw in a setup where the founder is constantly traveling is that if he dies suddenly before the succession plan is locked in, the whole company fractures. And in 1035, that is exactly what happens. Canute dies unexpectedly. He's only in his early 40s. And Emma is plunged into a desperate fight for survival.
The North Sea Empire shatters almost immediately upon Canute's death. Harthacnut, the chosen heir, is trapped over in Denmark. He's bogged down defending his territory against Norwegian threats led by Magnus the Good. He cannot get a fleet together to sail back to England. And into that vacuum steps Harold Harefoot.
Harold Harefoot is Cnut's son by his first consort, the other Elfgifu. He makes a move to seize the English throne. But Emma doesn't just fold and go back to Normandy. She barricades herself in the south. She holds the treasury at Winchester, and she initially secures the support of Earl Godwin, who is basically the most terrifying, powerful political boss in England at the time.
The country is effectively split in two. Harold controls the north and the Midlands. Emma is holding the south for Harthacnut. But as the months drag on and Harthacnut still doesn't arrive, Emma's support begins to bleed away. Earl Godwin realizes the wind is shifting toward Harold, and then, in 1036, a truly catastrophic event occurs. A letter is sent across the channel to Normandy, addressed to Emma's two older sons from her first marriage, Edward and Alfred.
The sons she hasn't seen in 20 years.
Right. The letter is purportedly from Emma. It invites them to come to England, claiming that the English nobles are ready to abandon Harold and throw their support behind the old Anglo-Saxon bloodline if they arrive to claim the throne.
Let's look at the mechanics of medieval correspondence here. Do we know if she actually wrote it?
It is one of the murkiest, most debated moments in English history. Did Emma write it out of sheer desperation, realizing Harthacnut wasn't coming, and hoping to use her older sons to secure her own position against Harold? Or was it a forgery, a sophisticated trap laid by Harold Harefoot to draw the rival claimants out of the safety of Normandy? Emma's own later propaganda would insist loudly that it was a forgery.
Honestly, given her track record of pragmatism, I wouldn't put it past her to have written it as a backup plan. But whoever wrote it, the trap works. Edward is cautious and approaches with a larger force, gets into a skirmish and retreats. But Alfred, the younger brother, takes the bait. He lands in England with a small retinue of Norman soldiers, and almost immediately he is intercepted by Earl Godwin, the very man who was supposed to be allied with Emma.
Godwin's betrayal is absolute. He meets Alfred, feigns loyalty, quarters Alfred's men in a town, and then in the middle of the night, Godwin's forces attack. They kill or mutilate most of Alfred's Norman companions. Godwin then hands Alfred over to Harold Harefoot's men, who take the young prince to the abbey at Ely.
And what happens at Eels is horrifying, but we need to explain why it happened. They didn't just execute him, did they?
No. They tied him to a spike and burned his eyes out with hot irons. The trauma and infection were so severe that Alfred died shortly after. He was only 28 years old.
It's gruesome, but there is a specific political logic to blinding in the medieval world, isn't there? Like, it wasn't just random torture.
Absolutely. Blinding wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was a constitutional disqualifier. In medieval political theology, a king had to be physically unblemished to rule. By blinding Alfred, Harold Harefoot didn't just inflict pain. He permanently removed Alfred from the line of succession without technically bearing the sin of outright executing a royal prince, though obviously the injuries proved fatal anyway.
Just pause for a second and imagine the emotional whiplash for Emma here. You are the Queen of the North Sea. You are corresponding with the Pope. You are the most powerful woman in Northern Europe.
Yeah.
And within months, your empire is gone. Your chief ally, Godwin, has betrayed you, and you receive word that the son you sent away 20 years ago to keep safe has been tortured to death, essentially on your doorstep. How does someone even recover from that?
The political fallout for Emma is instantaneous and devastating. The blinding of Alfred destroys any lingering support she had in the south. The nobles realize Harold is ruthless enough to do whatever it takes to hold power. Harold Harefoot takes total control of England. By 1037, Emma is forcibly stripped of her lands, her wealth is confiscated, and she is driven into exile in Flanders, settling in the city of Bruges with almost nothing to her name.
Stripped of her treasury, her castles, and her armies. But she still has her mind. And she realizes that if she's been stripped of all hard power, she has to resort to the only weapon she has left. Soft power. The pen. Which brings us to the year 1041 in Bruges.
Yes. In exile, Emma does something that is truly revolutionary for the era. She commissions a Flemish monk to write a book about her life and her family. It is called the Encomium Emma Reginae, in praise of Queen Emma.
This is my absolute favorite part of her entire story. It is a masterclass in political propaganda. She literally sits down with this monk and rewrites her own history. She tells him what to include, and more importantly, what to leave out. She entirely omits her first husband, Ethelred.
The omission is breathtaking in its audacity.
If you read this book without knowing the history, it reads as if Emma stepped off a boat from Normandy as a fresh-faced maiden, walked up the English beach, and jumps straight into Cnut's arms. She completely erases a decade of her life and the marriage that produced Edward the Confessor.
We have to look at the specific linguistic choices the monk makes. He frames her marriage to Canute not as a conquest, but as a peace-bringing union ordained by God to heal a fractured nation. But if we ask why she omits Ethelred, the political logic is flawless. In 1041, the political wheel was turning again. Harold Harefoot had recently died. Her son Harthacnut was finally assembling a fleet to claim England. Emma realized that she needed her legitimacy and Harthacnut's legitimacy to flow entirely from Canute and the victorious Danish line, not from the disgraced, defeated Anglo-Saxon line of Ethelred the Unready. She meticulously edited her past to legitimize her present.
It is exactly like a modern politician or a disgraced celebrity hiring an incredibly expensive crisis PR firm to completely scrub their Wikipedia page and rewrite their origin story. She's crafting an authorized biography while she's still alive to use it as a political weapon. How was this book actually used, though? Was it widely read?
It was a luxury manuscript, highly decorated. It wasn't meant for the common peasant. It was intended to be read aloud at the courts of European nobles, to be sent to key bishops and lords in England to prepare them for her return. Scholars point out that this is the first known work of political self-justification commissioned by a European queen. No one else was doing this. She fundamentally recognized that whoever controls the narrative controls the throne.
And her PR campaign works flawlessly because the timing is perfect. In 1040, Harold Harefoot dies. Harthacnut sails to England and is crowned king. And Emma, at roughly 60 years old, returns from exile in absolute triumph. The CEO is back in the building.
But the situation remains highly precarious. Harthacnut is king, but he is not well. The sources suggest he drinks heavily, his temper is erratic. He actually had Harold Harefoot's body dug up and thrown into a marsh, and Emma likely senses that he might not live long. He needs an heir, and he has no children. So in 1041, Harthacnut does something remarkable, almost certainly at Emma's urging. He invites his older half-brother Edward to return from Normandy and rule jointly with him.
Edward, the surviving son from Emma's deleted first marriage. The one who stayed in Normandy while Alfred was murdered. He actually comes back. And for a year, these two half-brothers who have every reason to distrust and hate each other managed to share power in England.
Until June 1042, Harthacnut is attending a wedding feast at Lambeth. He stands up to drink a toast, suddenly collapses in convulsions, and dies. He was only 24. Whether it was poison, which was always suspected in these sudden royal deaths, or a massive stroke, we will never know, but the result is absolute. In a single afternoon, the Danish royal line in England ends forever.
And Edward, the Confessor Emma's son, by her first husband, becomes the undisputed king of England. You would think, looking at this on paper, this is the ultimate victory for Emma. Her bloodline is secure. She's the mother of the king. But here comes the final twist.
Edward did not love his mother.
To put it mildly, I mean, how could he?
He hadn't seen her in decades. He'd grown up in exile in Normandy while she lived as the Queen of the North Sea in Winchester. He harbored deep, festering resentment that she had married his father's conqueror, that she had prioritized Cnut's children over him, and he almost certainly suspected she had failed to protect, or perhaps even betrayed, his brother Alfred.
So in 1043, one of his very first major acts as king is to enact a deeply personal revenge. He rides from Gloucester to Winchester with an armed retinue. He bursts into his own mother's apartments. He raids her treasury, strips her of all her lands, seizes her gold and silver, and severs her completely from political power.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that he took from her all she possessed, because she had formerly been very hard to the king her son, and did less for him than he wished. It is a brutal unseating. The woman who outlasted Sweyn Forkbeard, Ethelred, Canute, and Harold Harefoot, who buried 2 husbands and 2 sons, is essentially put under permanent house arrest by her surviving child. She is allowed to keep her dignity and a modest allowance, but the power is gone. She spends her last decade in quiet retirement, finally dying on March 6, 1052.
And in a final symbolic act, she is buried in the Old Minster at Winchester. But she's not buried next to Ethelred, her first husband. She is buried right beside Cnut and Harthacnut. Even in death, she controlled her narrative. She chose her side.
But her story doesn't end in 1052, does it? Because there is a massive historical butterfly effect that she sets in motion simply by existing.
This is the long shadow of Emma of Normandy. 14 years after she dies, in 1066, her son Edward the Confessor dies without an heir. This sparks the famous succession crisis. And who steps up with a legal claim to the English throne? William the Conqueror.
Emma's great-nephew. Because Emma sailed across the Channel in 1002 to marry Ethelred, the Norman ducal house had a direct hereditary blood tie to the English crown. William uses Emma's bloodline as the legal cornerstone to justify his invasion to the Pope and his lords. Hastings happens. The Anglo-Saxon nobility is wiped out.
Let's trace that logic clearly for the listener. If Emma doesn't marry Ethelred to close that back door in 1002, there is no Norman blood tie to England. There is no Norman conquest. There is no Anglo-Norman England. And if you think about the cultural impact, there's no fusion of Old English and Norman French. The very vocabulary we are using to speak right now, the language of Shakespeare, of Chaucer, of this deep dive, exists because Emma of Normandy survived the 11th century.
She was the biological and political bridge between the Viking Age and the High Middle Ages. She lived through 2 Viking conquests, 3 kings, 4 civil wars, the blinding of a sun, and wielded almost 50 years of power. She rewired the destiny of an island.
And I think that's why her portrayal in Vikings Valhalla is so satisfying to watch. The show refuses to flatten her into a simple villain, and it refuses to romanticize her as a tragic victim. It shows her exactly as she was, a survivor. She was dropped into a brutal patriarchal world that was entirely built to consume women like her, and she decided to consume that world instead. The show takes liberties with timelines, sure, but the essence of that character, the sharp mind that is always 2 moves ahead, is the absolute truth of the historical record finding its voice on screen.
It is a remarkable legacy to unpack, and it brings us full circle on everything we've discussed over these past 4 seasons.
It does. Which brings us to the grand farewell. You've been with us on this massive journey through the source material. We started out 30 discussions ago talking about gods and giants, Odin hanging on Yggdrasil, the fire of Muspelheim, and the early raids. We started in myth, and we end here in a cool stone minster in Winchester, with a Norman queen choosing a grave between 2 kings.
What's profound to consider is that the Viking world didn't simply vanish. It evolved. Emma carried the iron of that world across the channel in her blood, and half a century later, William carried it back. It shifted from long ships navigating rivers to stone castles dominating landscapes, from brute raiding to intricate statecraft. But it lives on in the institutional bones, the legal systems, and the language of every English-speaking country today.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We always hear that old cliche, history is written by the victors. But when you look at Emma of Normandy, sitting in exile in Bruges, commissioning the encomium, maybe the truth is much more complex. I don't think history is just written by the victors. It's written by the survivors. The people who have the sheer audacity to hire a scribe, skip the chapters they don't like, and commission their own legend. What happens to our understanding of the world when a civilization's foundational narrative is, at its core, just a brilliant cover-up by a mother trying to survive?
A provocative question, and a deeply fitting place to end.
Thank you for coming back for this one last story. The wheel kept turning, and it's still turning. But this time, the deep dive really is over. Goodbye.